Sometimes I think things would have been different if my dad hadn't died that spring morning. I was only 6, but I remember that day as clearly as if it happened yesterday. Everything seemed so ordinary, filled with warmth and comfort. The sun was gently breaking through the curtains in the kitchen. Mom, humming something in a quiet, affectionate voice, was setting the table, and Dad, in his eternal warm sweater, was cooking pancakes, deftly turning them over in the air, creating funny faces out of them, from which she laughed, clapping her hands. It was our Sunday morning magic, a little ritual that seemed to me as unchangeable as the changing of the seasons. "Haley, princess, come help me." His voice rang out, full of laughter and joy, when one of the tortillas landed unsuccessfully, folded in half. Your old man turned those masterpieces over again. He was waving a spatula like a magic wand, and I, forgetting everything, jumped up from the couch, leaving my battered but much-loved stuffed rabbit, and rushed into the kitchen. Everything was so familiar, that nothing foreshadowed trouble. I had almost reached Dad, and I was already reaching out to help him fix a failed pancake, when suddenly there was a thud. It was the shoulder blade that slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor with a thud. Dad clutched his chest, his face suddenly distorted into some strange, incomprehensible grimace, and the next second he collapsed to the floor, heavily, like a broken tree falling. I remember how I screamed, how I froze in place, not understanding what was happening, how my mother rushed to him in horror, calling his name, but he no longer answered. I remember everything that happened after that in fragments: the deafening sirens of the ambulance, the white hospital walls that seemed so cold, my mother's sobs echoing in the empty hallway. My father is gone. He just left. He left behind an empty house that seemed too big and too quiet, and I couldn't understand why this had happened and why no one could bring it all back. Mom didn't cry for long. Of course, she was grieving, but she did not allow herself to drown in this grief. I didn't know if it was her strength or just her desire not to stop, but soon Richard appeared in our house. They met at some kind of support group for widowed parents, and I remember the first time he came into our house tall, with kind eyes, with a smile that was so familiar that for a moment I even thought Dad had returned. He tried to be caring, attentive, always asking how my day was, interested in my school affairs, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that his appearance meant the final end of my past. A year later, Mom and Richard got married, and he became part of our family, taking a seat at the table where Dad used to sit. I tried to get used to it, tried to accept him, but something inside me wouldn't let me fully believe that he could replace the one I'd lost. And then my mom gave me another piece of news that turned my world upside down. She was pregnant. I remember how her face lit up with happiness when she told me that I was going to be an older sister. I was 8 when Tommy was born, and that's when everything really changed. At first, I was even happy. I liked to think that I would have someone who would call me sister, who would need me. But with his arrival, Mom seemed to have completely disappeared into him. She quit her job, saying that she needed Tommy, that these early years were the most important, that she should be by her side. I wanted to ask if my early years were as important to her, but the words stuck in my throat. I just watched as day after day she became more and more immersed in caring for Tommy, forgetting about me. She might not have cooked lunch for me at school, she might not even have noticed that I came home after school, and then she was absent-mindedly apologizing at dinner, already turning back to Tommy. Richard saw it. I noticed how he frowned when Mom fussed over her younger brother for the 100th time that day, ignoring me. He tried to talk to her, cautiously hinting that her obsession with Tommy was out of bounds, but each time these conversations ended with the same thing: Mom defended herself irritably, saying that Tommy was still young and that he required her attention. The tension in the house was becoming unbearable. Richard seemed to be the only one who noticed that Mom was missing something important, but she didn't want to hear it. One day, at dinner, when Tommy was about 5 years old, everything reached its peak. "Sarah," Richard began, carefully placing his fork on the table. "We need to talk about this. You can't keep being over his head all the time." He has to learn to do things on his own. Mom, who was sitting next to Tommy, leaned over as usual, coaxing him to eat another bite. She didn't even look at Richard. He's still young, she replied distantly. He's not a baby anymore, Sarah. Richard's voice remained calm, but there was firmness in it. You have to see what's going on. I held my breath, not taking my eyes off my mom. I wanted her to finally hear those words, understand them, and look around. But instead, she raised her head and looked at Richard as if he had just said something terrible. You don't understand, she said, and for the first time in a long time, there was a hint of coldness in her voice. I already knew how it would end. I already knew that Mom wouldn't listen. Mom's face immediately hardened, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her fingers convulsively gripped the edge of the tablecloth, as if she was trying to hold on to the last thread of self-control. What are you trying to say? That I'm a bad mother? Her voice was trembling with tension, and there was already a note of accusation in it, as if Richard had just inflicted a terrible insult on her. That's not what I mean, and you know it perfectly well, he replied, deliberately keeping his tone calm, even though I could feel him boiling deep down. But you have 2 children here, not 1. By the way, I have a husband too. I lowered my head, pretending to be extremely interested in my mashed potatoes, but in fact I was hanging on their every word. Tommy needs to. Mom started to speak, but Richard interrupted her, and there was an unusual irritation in his voice. And Haley? Don't you need it? Mom turned her head sharply in my direction, as if she had noticed me at the table for the first time, and I instinctively shrank back, trying to blend in with the furniture, but there was no remorse in her gaze, only annoyance that someone dared to question her maternal qualities. He's still so young, she said, as if that explained everything. I was young too, I muttered to myself, but no one heard me. The situation in the house reached a critical point when Richard suggested that Tommy enroll in minor league baseball. It sounded quite innocent, almost casual, but it was this idea that caused a storm that I did not expect. I was sitting on the stairs pretending to do my homework when I heard them arguing in the kitchen. Absolutely not. Mom's voice rang with indignation. Do you know how dangerous that is? He could get hit by a ball, twist his ankle, or, for God's sake, Sarah, he needs to get to know life, Richard interrupted, his voice getting louder than usual, which was rare. You can't protect him from everything. But Mom, as always, didn't back down. She enrolled Tommy not in the baseball section, but in art lessons at the community center, and I still remember his sullen face as he sat there, mindlessly running a brush over paper, while the other children at least tried to learn. He dropped out after 3 classes, and Mom immediately accused the teacher of simply not understanding her son's creative spirit. Meanwhile, Richard started spending more time with me. Maybe it was his way of balancing Mom's behavior, or maybe he just saw me as a child who finally needed someone. He took me to karate classes 3 times a week and sat through every session without missing a single one. He screamed louder than any other parent when I earned my belts, and in those moments I felt like I was still important to someone. But as I blossomed under his attention, Tommy became more and more difficult. His room was gradually turning into a dump with toys and clothes everywhere, and one day my mother looked at me with such an expression on her face that I realized I had just been appointed a cleaner. Haley, be a good girl and clean up Tommy's room, she said in a matter-of-fact tone that didn't even have a question in it, just an order. I opened my mouth to protest, but I could tell by the look on her face that it was useless. Richard, of course, got wind of our new agreement. She's not his maid, Sarah. For the first time, there was real fury in his voice. He has to learn how to clean up after himself. But Mom has already prepared her ultimate weapon. I knew you loved her more than you loved your own son. Her voice trembled, and I could see her eyes filling with tears. How can you treat Tommy like that? I watched Richard's face droop as the struggle left his eyes. He looked at me, and there was so much guilt in his gaze that I involuntarily turned away. He raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture and said softly, "Okay. Let it be your way." After that, he didn't argue with his mom about Tommy anymore. He knew it was useless. But I saw that he hadn't given up on me, even if he'd given up on fighting her. It was a small consolation, but sometimes small consolations are all we have left. Graduation day was both joyful and bitter. I stood in my cap and robes, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. I noticed Richard in the front rows. He was beaming with pride. His smile was so warm that I wanted to rush to him and hug him. Mom was there too, but she was constantly checking her phone, hardly paying attention to what was going on around her. She was probably texting Tommy's babysitter. That evening, when the sun had already disappeared below the horizon, leaving behind only a faint golden glow at the edge of the sky, Richard called me into his office. It was a cozy, lived-in room with a massive wooden table, shelves full of books, and the soft glow of a desk lamp that always created a sense of warmth and security. I walked in feeling strangely excited, even though I didn't know what exactly he wanted to tell me. "I've been saving up," he said, pulling a folder full of college brochures out of his desk drawer and handing it to me. "You can go anywhere you want, Haley. The world knows no borders." I froze, looking at the colorful booklets, on the covers of which were depicted smiling students, well-groomed campuses, and promises of a bright future. I was overwhelmed by several feelings at once: joy, gratitude, surprise, and at the same time fear. After all, it meant that I could really leave this house, escape from the shadow of Tommy and Mom's obsession, and start living the way I wanted. But before I could say anything, the door to the office was abruptly flung open, and Mom burst into the room. Her face was flushed with indignation, her eyes were sparkling, and her hands were clenched into fists. "You can't be serious," she exclaimed, looking from Richard to me and back again, as if hoping that one of us would come to his senses. "This money needs to be saved for Tommy's future. He'll need them more." I felt something tighten inside me, but Richard, on the other hand, looked completely calm. It was the expression I saw on his face every time he got into another confrontation with his mom. "This is non-negotiable, Sarah," he said, closing the folder and placing it in front of me. "I've already made my decision." And that was it. He didn't leave any room for arguments, didn't give Mom a chance to put Tommy at the center of everything again. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was important to someone too. In the end, I chose Marshall University in West Virginia, far enough away to start over, but not so far away that I couldn't come home sometimes. The day it was time to move into the dorm, Richard personally helped me pack my things, load the boxes into the car, and drive me to campus. "I'm proud of you, Haley," he said as we stood in front of the dorm building. "Mom didn't come. She explained this by saying that Tommy was not feeling well and could not bear her departure." I pretended that it didn't bother me. College life has become a welcome breath of fresh air for me. For the first time, I felt truly free from the shadow that always hung over me. There was no longer a comparison with Tommy. There were no daily reminders that I was not the center of my mother's universe. I called home every week, but most of the time I talked to Richard. Mom was always too busy taking care of Tommy, and if I managed to catch her, she would only casually ask how I was doing and immediately turn the conversation to her boy. "He's going through a difficult period," Richard explained to me in one of the calls, and his voice sounded tired. "He's hanging out with these kids, not the best company." "Did you try to influence him in any way?" I asked, knowing full well what the answer would be. "Of course. I tried to involve him in some extracurricular programs, but—" "Let me guess," I interrupted. "Did Mom say you were being too hard on him?" "Exactly," he replied dryly. "She called me a tyrant just because I suggested that he might need at least some kind of structure. In her opinion, I just don't understand how sensitive he is." Visits home became less frequent, because every time I returned, I saw Tommy moving away more and more. He hardly left his room, spent days playing video games, and when I tried to talk to him, he barely acknowledged my existence. One day I knocked on his door. "Tommy, do you want a brownie? I bought your favorites." The only response was the muffled sound of gunfire. He didn't even turn off the game to hear me. "He's not in the mood to talk," Mom said, walking past him down the hall. She didn't even look worried. "He's very tense." I just pressed my lips together, knowing it was hopeless. The contrast between our lives couldn't be brighter. While I was building my career, Tommy pursued virtual achievements, and my mother supported him in this, justifying his every act. Richard didn't say anything, but his face spoke for itself. By then, even he seemed to have given up trying to interfere. By the age of 27, I had finally saved up enough money to make a down payment on my own home. It was a small apartment in a nice neighborhood, just one room, but it was mine. The day I got the keys, I couldn't stop smiling. All these years of saving on lunchboxes, avoiding designer clothes, and deftly maneuvering between desires and necessities have finally paid off. Now I had my own place, a small but cozy apartment, a place where I could be myself, without having to adjust to someone else's expectations or put up with the eternal presence of other people's problems. "You should all come and see," I said during our weekly call home, trying to put as much joy into my voice as possible. "I have a housewarming party next Saturday. I'll cook dinner. Richard, even your favorite lasagna." "I wouldn't miss it for the world, baby," he replied warmly, and I could almost feel his smile on the other side of the line. But before I could say anything else, Mom's voice cut into the conversation. "Oh, honey, I don't think we can do this." Her voice sounded slurred, as if she was already looking for excuses in advance. "Why?" I asked, unable to hide the slight skepticism in my voice. "Tommy has plans for this day." "Plans?" I even laughed in disbelief. What could Tommy's plans be? "Very important," she replied, but I could hear a video game playing in the background, and everything became clear without words. On the day of the housewarming, only Richard appeared. He brought a pot with a plant and a bottle of wine, saying that Mom sends her regards to me. We both knew it was a lie. Over dinner, he told me about what was really going on at home. Tommy, now in his 20s, didn't bother with work or school. His days were spent either behind a computer screen or in the company of dubious friends whose entertainment was limited to cheap alcohol and thoughtless conversations. "I was trying to help," Richard said, twirling the pasta around on his fork. "I even offered him a place in my construction company, just as a starting point. You know, everyone needs to start somewhere." "And what's that?" I already knew what the answer would be, but I asked the question anyway. Sarah said it was beneath his dignity. I blinked, not immediately realizing the meaning of what was said. Beneath dignity? That's right. She said that Tommy was too smart for manual labor, that he deserved something more. I slammed the glass down on the table. Too smart to work, but not too smart to sit on her neck. Richard smiled sadly. "I keep trying, Haley," he said softly. "God knows, I keep trying." That was our last real conversation. 2 years later, I got a call, and everything changed. Richard collapsed at work. Severe heart attack. Like my father's. By the time I got to the hospital, he was gone. The funeral seemed unreal, as if someone had replaced reality with a theatrical production. Mom put on a real show, crying dramatically and telling everyone who was willing to listen what a wonderful husband Richard was. "We were so happy," she wailed, sobbing. "How are we going to cope without him?" I watched her performance with a mixture of disgust and pity. I knew her tears weren't for Richard. They were for her. I could see her mind racing through options. Without his income, how could she support Tommy in the lifestyle he was used to? Tommy didn't even bother to put on a proper suit. He appeared in a rumpled polo shirt and old khaki trousers. During the ceremony, he kept his eyes on his phone, and I wasn't sure if he was even aware of what had happened. Mom, of course, found an excuse for him. He's just going through his grief in his own way, she told me when I caught her eye. I looked at her and realized that we no longer speak the same language. Standing at Richard's grave, I couldn't help but think about how history repeats itself. Another man I loved left because of a broken heart. Another image of his father, another heart attack, another funeral. Only now was I old enough to see everything clearly, including the fact that Mom's tears were more about her bank account than her broken heart. A year has passed since Richard's death. I almost lost touch with my mom and Tommy, and to be honest, I didn't care. Everything I knew about them reached me through Aunt Linda's rare calls. They live on Richard's savings, she told me one day. I nodded silently, not surprised. Your mom sold it to Chevrolet last month. I felt something unpleasant prick in my chest, but I didn't say anything. Before that, she sold his tools. Tools? I asked again. Clean it up, my aunt sighed. I think she needed the money. Of course we do. She was used to the fact that money came naturally, that Richard always took care of her and Tommy, and now that he was gone, she was faced with a harsh reality that she was completely unprepared for. I tried not to pay attention, telling myself that I really didn't care, but when my mom's number popped up on my phone screen one Tuesday evening, my heart skipped a beat. I looked at the display, pressed my lips together, and allowed myself to take a deep breath before picking up the phone, as if that could prepare me for the inevitable. Haley, her voice sounded quieter than I remembered, somehow faded, cracked, as if fatigue had burned a hole in it. I need you to come home. Something in her tone made me not ask questions, not argue, not say that I have a job, business, life. After all, I just booked a ticket for the next flight and the next day I was already driving up to the house where I spent my childhood. I barely recognized him. The lawn, once green and well-tended, was now overgrown with weeds. The peeling paint on the window frames was twisted in cracked layers, and one of the shutters hung on a hinge, swaying in the wind. The house that Richard had kept in perfect order now looked as if it had been forgotten, as if it was slowly being swallowed up by desolation, as if it were a reflection of what was happening inside. But the house wasn't the only thing that aged badly. When Mom opened the door, I had to stifle a sigh. The woman I remembered, the one who always looked after herself, styled her hair perfectly, wore a neat manicure and watched her posture, was gone. In her place was someone else, a woman who looked 20 years older than her age. Deep wrinkles lined her face, her eyes were covered with a veil of chronic fatigue, and long gray roots made their way through the parting of her hair, which she no longer tried to color over. Haley, she said, leading me into the living room. I could barely keep from wincing. The house smelled musty, the dishes in the sink were piled high, untouched for a long time, and there was a thin layer of dust on the furniture. It was strange, almost surreal, to see chaos in a place where everything should have been perfect before, where she could make me wash the dishes if she noticed even one speck of water on them. I carefully sat down on the sofa, and the spring immediately dug into my thigh. Richard would have fixed it immediately. Mom, what's going on? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it still sounded worried. She lowered her head, locking her fingers together and squeezing them so that the knuckles turned white. Everything broke almost immediately, she muttered without looking up. We're running out of money, Haley. My pension barely covers utilities, and my savings. She clasped her hands tighter in her lap. There are almost none left. I watched in silence as she struggled to pronounce these words. What about Tommy? I asked, even though I already guessed what the answer would be. Does he help with expenses? Her face was frozen, and I could see this complicated dance going on inside her between embarrassment and protection, as she hesitated between admitting the truth and defending him again at all costs. He's looking for a job, she finally said. It's not his fault. These employers, they just don't understand him. I took a deep breath. What do you mean? The last place he went expected him to start at 8 in the morning. You know Tommy's not a morning person. I blinked at him. And the previous one? I expected him to do manual labor. Her lips tightened, and she shook her head. With his intelligence. I felt my jaw clench. Mom, he's 20, free. At his age and without experience, he can't afford to be so picky. You don't understand, she cut me off, and there was that familiar irritation in her voice that I'd heard over the years whenever she defended Tommy. Then her tone abruptly changed. Haley, we need your help. We can't survive without her. I hate to ask, but you're doing so well in your career. I knew what was going to happen. I knew that voice, that intonation, and I knew that now it would remind me that I was a daughter, that a family should help each other. Part of me wanted to refuse, to remind her of all the times she'd chosen Tommy over me, when my food, my attention, my importance had been sacrificed in the name of his convenience. But looking at her exhausted face, trembling hands, desperate eyes, I couldn't. How much do you need? $1,500 a month. I almost choked on it. It was a significant part of my salary. But I nodded anyway. When I got up from the couch to leave, already regretting my decision, I asked one last question. Where is Tommy now? Mom perked up a little. Oh, he's in an interview, she said with a slight smile. A very promising position in a technology company. Through the window, I could see the light in his bedroom and the familiar flicker of his computer screen. Some things have never changed. True to my word, I've set up an automatic transfer of $1,500 to Mom's account every month. Every time I saw this deduction from my bank account, I told myself that I was doing the right thing, even if it meant postponing my own plans, moving into a bigger apartment, replacing my old car, the long-awaited vacation that I had been saving for so long. I convinced myself that I was doing what I had to do, that it was just money, that my mother really needed help, but the more time passed, the harder it was for me to continue believing in this illusion. I began to come more often, and every time I crossed the threshold of this house, I felt as if time had frozen here, as if I was returning not to reality, but to a frozen capsule of the past. Tommy was always there, in the same place, in the same position, either glued to the computer screen or sprawled on the couch with a beer in his hand, his face illuminated by the bluish light of the monitor, and his expression was indifferent, as if he didn't care about anything. How is the job search progressing? I asked, knowing what the answer would be. Mind your own business, he'd snap, not even turning around, or just grumble something unintelligible and turn up the volume of his playing. During the holidays, it was especially hard for me to see the house in such a state. The living room, once cozy, now looked abandoned. The wallpaper was peeling off at the joints, and there was an ugly water stain on the ceiling that would drive Richard crazy if he were here. At some point, I couldn't stand it. I spent my Christmas bonus on hiring contractors to put everything in order. Of course, Mom took it for granted, not a word of thanks, just the usual, "You've always been so caring, Haley." In February, my mother twisted her ankle. I called her the next day to check if everything was okay. "Oh, it's not that bad," she said, but I could hear the pain in her voice. "Is Tommy helping you?" "He's busy," she faltered. "At some online job interviews." I didn't argue. The next day, I just hired an au pair. The money I saved for my vacation went to her salary for the next 3 weeks. And then the day came when I walked into the house and saw a stranger sprawled on our couch. She looked like she'd stepped out of a reality show, fake nails long enough to be used as weapons, a thick layer of makeup that left her face no chance to breathe, short shorts that looked more like underwear, and a top that barely covered her breasts. She scrolled through the pages on her phone, indifferently surrounded by empty bags of chips and cans of soda. "Who are you?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer inside. Tommy came out of his room, stretching lazily and giving me a condescending look, as if I were an uninvited guest in his house, and not the other way around. "This is Candy," he announced, completely unabashed. "My fiancée." I blinked at him. Candy didn't even bother to look up from her phone, just loudly popped her gum. I watched in disbelief as she reached into the bag of groceries I just brought, pulled out the cookies I'd bought for Mom, and began to chew lazily while continuing to scroll through something on the screen. "Nice to meet you," I muttered to myself, unable to believe that all this was really happening. Later that evening, I called my mom. "Did you know about this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Oh, Haley." Her voice sounded more alive than I'd heard it in months. "Isn't that wonderful? Tommy has finally settled down." I almost laughed at the absurdity of those words. Settle down? Candy was such a good influence on him, Mom continued enthusiastically. "He hasn't been drinking with those awful friends in weeks." "That's because she drinks all my imported beer," I thought, remembering the empty bottles I'd noticed in the dumpster, but decided to keep quiet. "And he's talking about getting a job," Mom added happily. I closed my eyes, preparing to hear another fairy tale. Candy's cousin knows someone at a tech startup, and Tommy says this could be his big break. I made a vague sound, not knowing what to say. There have been too many big breakthroughs in recent years that have led to nothing, but Mom continued to live in her bubble of hope, and I didn't have the heart to destroy it. My next visit home started like any other. I was juggling grocery bags, pushed open the front door, and froze in place. The house looked like a tornado had passed through it. Dirty dishes piled up in the sink, takeout containers were scattered on all surfaces, the kitchen table, the coffee table, even on the armrests of the sofa. Clothes were crumpled and dirty on the living room floor, mixed with shoes, crumpled blankets, and what looked like the remains of a torn chip wrapper. I took a step forward, carefully stepping over the mess, and felt a wave of irritation, bewilderment, and something else rise inside me that I couldn't name yet. Some things never change. But it seems that something has gotten worse. Candy was sprawled out on the couch, her perfectly manicured nails drumming on the phone screen with a nasty rhythm, and despite my appearance, she didn't even deign to look up, continuing to mindlessly scroll through the tape. I silently began to lay out the groceries, trying not to pay attention to the chaos that reigned around: empty bottles, crumpled fast food packages, some pieces of paper, dirty plates stacked right on the coffee table. "You know," I said, trying to keep my voice level, but irritation was already boiling inside me. "You live here for free, eat the food I pay for. The least you can do is wash at least a couple of dishes after yourself." She slowly raised her eyes, and a smirk appeared on her parched, heavily made, uplit smug, insolent, openly triumphant. "Who are you to come here and give orders?" She drawled lazily, blowing a bubble out of her gum. "This is not your house." I gritted my teeth. "I grew up here," I retorted. "And you're just a guest." That's when she laughed, a sharp, piercing, mechanical sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, honey, you got it all wrong." Her voice became melodiously sweet, like a predator savoring her victory. "This house belongs to Tommy now." I froze, the words hanging in the air, not immediately finding a response in my mind. "What?" "Your mom copied everything onto it," she continued with obvious pleasure, watching my reaction. "There is a will." I felt an icy lump tighten in my stomach, but without saying another word, I walked past her into the kitchen. Mom was sitting at the table, sorting through some coupons that she hadn't used. "Is that true?" My voice sounded strange, as if it didn't belong to me. "Did you make a will, leaving everything to Tommy?" At first she didn't look at me, her fingers continued to sort through the papers, but then something changed in her face, as if a switch had flipped inside her. "Yes," she replied flatly, and there was no trace of regret in her voice. I blinked, unable to process what I just heard. "I don't understand," I whispered. I wanted to say more. I wanted to remind her that all these years I had been helping her, sending money, providing for them with Tommy while he was idling, but the words stuck in my throat. "I'm helping you," I finally said, feeling anger begin to rise inside. "I send you money every month. Tommy doesn't work, he doesn't contribute anything." Mom's face tightened, and irritation flashed in her eyes. "Don't you dare talk about your brother like that," she said sharply. "You don't understand him. You've never understood him. What is there to understand?" I took a step forward. "He's a parasite. He's quite happy to live on my money while his girlfriend trashes our house." "Oh, stop being so dramatic." She waved it off, and there was something new in her face, something cold, cruel that I hadn't seen before. And then she uttered the words that buried all my hopes, all my futile attempts to earn her love. "Do you want to know the truth?" She looked me straight in the eye, and her lips twitched in a strange half-smile. "I've never loved you the way I love Tommy." I felt the ground give out from under my feet. "He's better than you in every way that matters." I couldn't breathe. "And I don't want you here anymore." The words were like lashes, painful, leaving bloody marks on the soul. All these years, I've been telling myself that Mom loved me, just showing it in a different way, that somewhere beneath her obsession with Tommy, there was at least a grain of caring for me. I knew better now. I turned around and went out. Candy's triumphant laughter followed me down the hall. 21 years of hoping, making excuses, trying to earn my mother's love, it all ended with the quiet click of the door slamming shut behind me. The road home was blurred, covered in a fog of numb stupor. I don't remember the 4-hour drive. I don't remember climbing the stairs to my apartment. I don't even remember sitting on the couch. But I clearly remember the moment of clarity that came when I looked at the phone screen, seeing the entire history of bank transfers. Every month. $1,500. My finger hovered over the screen for a moment, but this time there was no doubt or hesitation. I resolutely clicked Cancel Regular Payment. For the next few weeks, I immersed myself in my work, filling every minute, every hour with something useful, just to avoid letting myself wallow in disappointment, in the void that appeared after this conversation. But at some point, I caught myself thinking that the hole in my budget that had previously seemed like a burden to me had suddenly become an opportunity. An opportunity that I could use on myself. I started exploring investment options for the money that had been irretrievably going home all these years. Maybe I can finally start saving for my own house. A real house. A house where there will be no place for the ghosts of the past. Exactly 1 month after my last visit, my mother called home. "The money hasn't arrived," she said without preamble, without greeting, without the usual, "How are you?" As if there had never been a breakup between us, as if she hadn't thrown me out of her life as easily as people get rid of unnecessary things. "There must be some kind of mistake at the bank," she continued, and I could hear the exasperated impatience in her voice, as if it was just a technical problem that needed to be fixed, and now I, like an obedient daughter, would rush to correct this mistake. "There's no mistake," I replied, and I was surprised at how even and calm my voice was. I canceled the transfers. In the silence that followed, I could almost hear her nostrils flaring, her fingers clenching into fists, and a storm brewing inside her. And it didn't take long. "How dare you?" she exploded. "After all I've done for you?" I even laughed. A real, sincere laugh, full of bitter realization. "Everything you've done for me?" I asked, grinning. "How's the mom who forgot about me? Like the man who forced me to be Tommy's maid? Or like the woman who looked me in the eye and said she'd never loved me?" "This is different," she said in the same voice I'd heard countless times, the voice she used to defend Tommy. "You know I was upset. But you can't just stop helping us." We are counting on this money. I closed my eyes, clutching my phone with my fingers, resisting the urge to throw it at the wall. Tommy and Candy are planning a vacation to Cancun. They need a vacation. I cut her off abruptly, feeling my rage rising. Does Tommy need a vacation? My voice rose, and even I was afraid of the anger that sounded in it. From what, Mom? From video games? From beer? Let me tell you something. Tommy doesn't need a vacation. He needs a job. How dare you talk about your brother like that? Stop it, she yelled, and I could almost see her face turning angry, her chest heaving with rage. You're just jealous. Jealous? I laughed bitterly. What is it, Mom? There was no answer, but I could hear her breathing through the phone, heavy, ragged, full of suppressed anger. Because what? I pressed it. And then she spat it out. Because you left us, and it's all on him now. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the bridge of my nose with my fingers. Fine, I said evenly. You've made your choice. Now he can take care of you. You're ungrateful, mercantile, pathetic. The rest of her tirade dissolved into a torrent of accusations and demands that no longer had any power over me. I let her rage for a few more moments, and then I said calmly, almost with relief. Goodbye, Mom. Don't call me anymore. And before she could answer, I blocked her number. But Mom wasn't done. Over the next few weeks, messages began pouring in from all possible channels. Facebook, I'm struggling to pay the bills. You left me like an unnecessary trash. Instagram, you're a terrible daughter. I don't deserve such betrayal. Emails, don't you remember how many sacrifices I've made for you? I live for you and Tommy, and that's what you're doing to me? Victims. What kind of victims? I couldn't remember any of them. And then Tommy joined in. Mom is crying because of you, he wrote. You better start sending money again, otherwise. I blocked him. But not before replying. Here's a crazy idea. Try to get a job. Even Candy decided to do her bit, and, to my amazement, through LinkedIn. Her long message was full of outrage about how I broke the heart of a poor mother, how Tommy is too sensitive to handle the stress of work, and how I should have understood better that family is the most important thing. I almost admired her creativity. It's been 6 months now. I do not know how they are doing. And for the first time in my life, I don't feel guilty about it. Maybe they finally realized that Tommy has to support himself. Maybe they're still waiting for me to give up and start sending money again. Maybe they found someone else to manipulate. The truth is, I don't need to know. What I do know is that the $1,500 I used to send them every month went towards the down payment on my own house. I know that I sleep better at night now, no longer waking up to angry messages and guilt-inducing calls. I know Richard would be proud of me for finally standing up for myself. The other day, I was driving past a construction site and saw a sign. Employees required. For a moment, I considered taking a picture of her and sending it to Tommy. But then she just smiled and drove on. Their problems are no longer my problems. Finally, after all these years, I'm free.